Hi everyone. The EcoLab webinar will begin very soon. We just let the audience come into the webinar group. It will begin very soon. So just sit back and relax for the time being.
Ryan, you're on mute.
Oh, thanks so much. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the EcoLab webinar series. My name is Ryan, and I'm leading the Smart Cities and Future Mobility effort at EcoLabs Centre of Innovation for Energy. I will be hosting this session. EcoLabs, jointly established by Nanyang Technological University, Enterprise Singapore, and Sustainable Energy Association Singapore, SEAS, aims to build and accelerate deep tech energy innovation capability in Singapore to support the nation's future energy transition. This joint initiative aims to help Singapore-based energy startup and SME successfully commercialize and scale their innovation efforts by providing them with the following: translational research, living testbeds, innovation programs, funding partners, and community platform. As the COVID situation is going on, we are organizing the EcoLabs webinar series to continue the engagement and interaction with our partners, where we invite industry experts to offer their insight on respective topics. This webinar series comprises of 5 themes: Startup Series, Insight Series, Corporate Series, Investor Series, and EcoLab Series, each focusing on the different aspect of the innovation ecosystem. Today's session is part of the EcoLab series, where we discuss and explore the sectorial or technology opportunity, market entry, as well as support and resources available for startup in Singapore and beyond. Today's webinar titled Hydrogen for Mobility, Land, Sea, and Air, presented by Dr. Aravind Mutaya, Lead Mobility and Energy Storage at EcoLabs Centre of Innovation for Energy. In this session, Aravind will assess the factor driving hydrogen adoption from a market and technological perspective, present trends and insight from this perspective, and to determine the disruptive potential of hydrogen in the mobility sector. Lastly, he will also detail a case study of technology roadmap for hydrogen-powered buses. Dr. Aravind is the lead for mobility and energy storage at EcoLabs. He works on due diligence, technology assessment, road mapping, and scoping for proposal for translation of prototypes to commercially viable products. His core competency is in cathode materials for lithium-ion batteries, which were the subject of his PhD studies at NTU in partnership with Johnson Metal. He has a background in chemical engineering and has previously co-founded a waste plastic to carbon nanotube upcycling company. So towards the end of each session, we have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. If you have any questions, you can key in your question in the Q&A button or raise your hand so that we can unmute you to voice your question during the interaction. Now, without further ado, we would like to pass the session to Dr. Aravind. Dr. Aravind, please.
Hello. Thanks, Ryan. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see a good turnout on a morning here in Singapore, and if you're coming from overseas as well. As Ryan introduced, I'm leading the energy storage and mobility sector with EcoLabs, and the hydrogen roadmap is a work in progress for us, where we are detailing different sectors specifically in mobility, maritime, urban air mobility, and as well as road transport. And the work I will be presenting today is part of that sort of roadmap that we are developing. So I can probably start sharing my screen now, just a minute. Ryan, just to confirm, is the screen visible? Any issues?
Yes, it's okay.
All right, okay. So Yeah, the focus today will be on hydrogen for mobility. And when I talk about mobility, we're covering three aspects here: maritime, aviation, as well as land transport. And the objective of this webinar is mainly to first provide an understanding of what are the key drivers here and why people are going for a hydrogen economy. What are the trends in this hydrogen economy that have happened so far? Why is hydrogen so competitive? Then we dive into one of the core aspects of uh, realizing this sort of hydrogen economy for transport in the form of fuel cells. And we finally try to see whether is this really hype, or is there a truth or value to what we see in terms of fuel cells uh, and the hydrogen economy moving forward. Finally, I'll conclude with a case study on public transport, particularly buses, which we have noticed to be a first mover in adopting a lot of the hydrogen-related solutions. So the first point we would like to address is the drivers. What are the key drivers for a hydrogen economy? There are mainly two of them, and it's nothing more complicated. The first is push towards lower carbon emissions. We have only 10 years remaining to achieve the 1.5 degree Celsius warming goal. And the second is the falling costs of renewables and hydrogen. This is mainly in terms of solar PV as well as battery technologies. Now, the key indicators which show that there is a push towards hydrogen economy is first the national roadmaps that have been put out. There are around 19 of them. I will dwell into them a bit later. And of course, the industry alliances which are being formed and consolidation in the industry from the previous hydrogen fuel cell hype that was there to now a more measured approach to deploying this fuel cell technology and hydrogen related technology. So when we are looking at emissions, one of the key areas that emits a lot is transport. And we need to understand where the different sort of emissions come for the transport sector. So broadly, the transportation sector can be divided into road transport as well as non-road. Road consists of your buses, bikes, heavy trucks, light trucks, and of course, freight and passenger are the subdivisions under that. Under non-road, we have three major aspects. One is marine, air, and rail falls under other. So as you can see here, the key three major forms of transport which use a lot of energy and therefore emit a lot of carbon is road primarily, marine and air are on equal footing, and rail is quite low. So the focus here today is not so much on rail, and it's only primarily on the first. The investment trends for this hydrogen sector have been quite erratic over the past few years. As you can see, it had hit around 250 million in the third quarter of 2019. This was a big influx of cash from CNH Industrial, which was looking to support the company called Nikola, which makes heavy-duty trucks powered by fuel cells. And they have a unique business model of leasing out the trucks to their customers and basically running it as a service that way, maintaining and running the vehicle itself. So there was a huge cash injection of over 250 million by that particular company, CNH Industrial, which is Italy-based, which is what has caused this spike. But apart from that, there are a number of other players. Hydrogen refuel accelerator is quite popular. From last round, it had funded around 6 companies in this sector. And we have Blue Ashwa Capital within our own ranks, who are also looking to fund hydrogen-related technologies. A number of these companies are corporate. So CNH Industrial is corporate. Cummins, Weichai from China is also corporate. And we have Air Liquide, a major hydrogen producer. Their VC arm also coming from the corporate side to fund a lot of these efforts. primarily we think this is because of the huge capital involved and a lot of integration required to work with big players. In terms of the trends of policy, there have been 19 countries that have released roadmaps so far, and it is still counting. Now, the focus of the roadmaps has been classified here in this table, and it spans a multitude of areas, right? From production to industrial processes, to electricity generation, household heating, and of course, transport or even export. Now, what stands out in this table is across all the countries, the key priority has been to include transport as part of their roadmap. And this predominant focus is what makes the fuel cell a extremely critical technology to realizing the hydrogen economy. The focus so much is not on generation, primarily because hydrogen can be obtained through other industrial feedstock or other sorts of processes. But as you can see, the key focus has been on transport, and that is in line with what we would like to present today. In terms of patents, over the last 5 years, there have been a number of companies which have patented a lot of technologies under the fuel cell tag. Around 40,000 of those patent results were obtained. But the top 6 of these patents were filed primarily by Japanese-based companies, here Toyota, Honda, and Nippon, and also Chinese universities. So surprisingly, there was not a lot of Chinese companies involved, showing that the Chinese universities are leading the effort in fuel cell innovation and translation. There is, of course, one Korean company as well. So now we dive into each particular sector and try to understand the trends that are governing them so far. So first is the aviation sector. Here, by far, the adoption seems to be the least, mainly because of a lot of regulations and trials to be done before this hydrogen can be adopted fully. So there is a roadmap for 2030 provided by Hydrogen Europe. And the current state of the art in aviation-related technologies is mainly on drones or UAVs, but this has not yet taken off in a big way, mainly because of certain numbers and on the cost of hydrogen, which I'll get into a bit later. What we're seeing, though, is its viability for hydrogen, but for viability for aviation on a larger scale, so for passenger planes. But since the regulations are required to be in place, the timeline for realizing that is quite long. So we have 3 major timelines here from 2023 to 2025, and 2030. The main demonstrations would take place towards this 2030 period, which is when we also expect to see a lot of urban air mobility related technologies to be deployed. Now, one of the key numbers to note here is around the period of 2023 to 2025, the expectation is to drop hydrogen costs to around $1,500 USD per kilowatt. This is the fuel cell cost. That is one of the key requirements in terms of realizing this roadmap for aviation. On the maritime side, there is a lot more impact. So the first table we have here shows the difference between internal combustion engines, fuel cells, as well as other forms of powering a boat. Now, today, the key technology that is viable is ammonia. The closest in terms of low carbon is ammonia with an ICE engine. However, LNG is the most preferred right now, along with VLSF. Now, as we go long term, that's where fuel cell starts playing a major role. And as you can see here, the key cost for fuel cell powered boats is the cost of delivering hydrogen or ammonia, whichever form the fuel is in. It takes up at least 50% of the total cost of ownership while running that particular boat. And that is one of the key areas where if there is a focus to drive down these prices, there would be a greater impact. In terms of the storage of hydrogen itself for fuel cell powered boats, the percentage is quite low. So that is not a critical driver in terms of a high cost. Similarly, when it comes to the fuel cell, it barely occupies less than 5% of the entire cost, 5 to 10%. So the key driver to making these sort of boats viable is to drive down the cost of delivering hydrogen or ammonia. Now, these boats, like vehicles, can be classified into multiple classes. There are 4 of them. The first is small urban ferries. Second is inland vessels or ferries on short routes. The third is large cruises, and the third is offshore ships. Sorry, and the fourth is large cruises. Now, they are classified, and the fuel cells for each one of these applications and the fuel for each of these applications is based on the sort of range that the vehicle operates in terms of autonomy. So is it less than a day or over multiple days? And in terms of power, how much power is required to carry probably a heavier load versus a lighter load. Now, what we have seen is for the classes 1 and 2, hydrogen in its pure form, so either liquefied hydrogen or pressurized hydrogen, can be used to power both these sort of systems. Mainly because the volume of hydrogen required to power larger systems takes up a lot of space on the boat. So they're more viable for shorter span systems. In addition, LNG and CNG are viable fuels. In the case of large ships or offshore ships, where there's high autonomy as well as high power required, methanol or ammonia seem to be the most preferred solutions. And again, LNG or CNG can also be used to power these boats. An example of such a boat quite recently was by company Ulstein, and as you can see, there are 2 types of tanks placed into the system here, and it's a fully fuel cell powered boat with a diesel genset on board to provide backup. Now, when it comes to cost for maritime transport, the viability right now seems to be on the smaller ships. So the first type of ship is the regional ferry, which covers around 15 kilometers every round trip. And the second type of boat that we can that make it viable for fuel cells upfront is the RoPax, or it's a slightly larger ferry for roll-on and roll-off of passengers as well as vehicles. And the round trip is around 20 kilometers. You can see the ranges here are quite short and allows for quick refueling times. So for each one of these boats, there are 3 plots here. The plot in gray provides the current cost in terms of diesel. The plot in blue, dark blue, provides the fuel cell costs over time. And the light blue provides the battery vehicle cost. So if you look at the regional ferry, the crossover point between battery vehicles and hydrogen vehicles happens around 2025 to 2030. So this is the key period to watch out for. So it would happen in the next not in the early part of the next decade, but the later part of the next decade. But it takes another 5 years or so for it to become far more worthwhile compared to diesel as a fuel. So this plot is mainly on total cost of ownership. It's a USD per kilometer of the vehicle plying. And one of the key things to notice is also how the prices of the fuel cell operation is split. So there are 4 parts to it. First, you have the fuel cell powertrain itself, which is the primary capex. Then you have other capex in the form of the ship's hull and other inverters, maybe battery systems, and motors and all of that. The third part is the fuel cost itself while operating. And the last part is maintenance and other operational costs. So it's split into 4 parts. And as you can see, the fuel cell part is just only 1% of the total cost. So any changes here will have still a negligible impact on advancing this curve to make it better than battery vehicles. The core requirements is on new ship design and reducing the cost of other components which go into the capex. In the case of RoPax as well, you have a similar trend. You have the split across 1% for powertrain and 44% for capex. So again, if the focus is on the other additional equipment which complement the powertrain, that's where the cost reduction can happen and is a good place for any startup to focus its efforts. So unlike the case of the regional ferry, the RoPax makes the battery-powered boat as well as the hydrogen-powered boat viable around 2030. Both of them are on par at that point. And they pretty much stay on course till 2050. This mainly shows that the hydrogen fuel-powered boat is more effective in shorter range segments when compared to battery electric vehicles. So that concludes the maritime sector, and now I'll move into the road transport sector, which is the bulk of the presentation so far. Just to recap what we have gone through a bit before, there are a number of transport segments. You have ships, trains, maritime, and then you have the land transport systems. This chart here shows you the potential at which each of these potential point in the future, and when these systems start becoming completely viable in terms of commercial deployment. So for ships and airplanes, it seems 2030 and beyond is the timeline we're looking at. But as I just showed earlier, for smaller ships, we're looking at 2025 to 2030. In terms of road transport, which is what we'll get into now, the changes will happen in the next decade, and it comes thick and fast, right from forklifts for heavy-duty applications, then city buses, and a host of other vehicles, ending with smaller minibuses in 2030. So this decade would be a decade of change and a decade where hydrogen finally becomes viable for road transport. So when we look at road transport, there are mainly 3 basic types of vehicles out there today. The fuel cell vehicle, FCEV, the battery electric vehicle, which is in vogue now, and then the diesel IC engine or gasoline powered vehicle. So currently, the diesel powered vehicles, of course, are the most have the lowest cost of total cost of ownership, while the battery vehicles are almost reaching on par due to subsidies and a few other increased utilization of infrastructure. However, as we go into the longer term, fuel cell and battery are expected to lower down and become much cheaper than diesel. So when we say long term, we are looking at within the next 10 years. Similarly, when we are looking at So when we're looking at vehicles for trucks, so this is for the chart on the left is for passenger vehicles, and the chart on the right is for trucks, heavy-duty trucks. The viability of battery electric vehicles is slightly more expensive, as you can see here in the long term, where fuel cell vehicles start becoming more viable. Let's go a bit more into detail on these numbers and see how it will affect. The competitiveness of hydrogen is split. I mean, there are two main drivers. One is the cost of it being cheaper than conventionally available solutions. And the other is how low the emissions can go. So what we have here is a chart of the different land transport based vehicles that are available today. And the chart here basically indicates that if the vehicle is farther up towards your the topmost quadrant towards the right, you have a very competitive case of hydrogen powered vehicles with a very low emission. While if it's closer towards the quadrant towards the left bottom, the competition is quite high, meaning that conventional fuels are better. And in terms of low carbon, again, the emissions are higher with hydrogen, so it's not particularly viable. So what we see here is on the top right is where any vehicle would like to be, and any fuel cell powered vehicle would like to be. And what we see is heavy duty trucks are right up there. And this is the area that Nikola, the company, is focusing on to drive its innovation. The other areas that are equally viable are long distance coaches. These are buses between cities. Then long distance urban buses, as well as short distance urban buses. The reason these particular vehicles have been highlighted is so that we can delve deeper into the case study later and see why exactly they seem to be so viable, both on the emission side as well as the competition with conventional solutions in terms of cost. When you look at maritime sector, I had previously mentioned the small regional ferry, as well as the RoPax, which is also called a large regional ferry. And these two are on the left-hand side of this quadrant that we have. So in terms of competition with conventional solutions, these are not yet there. And that's primarily because they still have a bit of time to go between 2025 to 2030 to actually be to move towards the right-hand side and be fully viable compared to existing solutions. When it comes to aviation, you can see it's quite far on the left, and that's where the push still requires a lot more time before hydrogen and fuel cells can be fully viable. So now let's focus on this particular sector, where we are looking at road transport vehicles and those which are immediately viable and how they compare to battery electric vehicles. So the chart here shows the timeline again for these particular vehicles in terms of the earliest sort of vehicles that can be realized are between the 2020 and 2025 range, and they are the urban buses, the small ferry, and the heavy duty trucks. When it comes to other vehicles such as aviation and the large ferry, we'll have to wait a bit more longer, 2030 and beyond. Now, when we look at the two main sort of vehicles from the road transport side, heavy duty trucks as well as large passenger vehicles, these are the highest quantity on the road. The split across how much goes into this total cost of ownership is provided here. There are four main drivers which contribute to the cost of a hydrogen vehicle. The first is the hydrogen production, where it gets its hydrogen from. The second is the hydrogen distribution. The third is the equipment capex, so that is the vehicle and its fuel cell. And then the fourth is the OPEX. So as you can see, for heavy duty trucks, the key driver is the hydrogen production. It takes about 40% of your total cost, while distribution is the next segment. So Nikola's model of basically leasing out their solution is mainly to cover this kind of cost, where they produce the hydrogen on their own, and they set up distribution networks for their own fuel powered hydrogen fuel cell powered trucks. So they're hoping to drive down costs here so that they can make a profit. While if the focus is purely on the fuel cell, which constitutes only roughly around 30% of the total cost, the impact is not as much. When it comes to large passenger vehicles, the situation is quite different. The core focus is on the equipment, because that occupies more than 60% of your total cost of ownership of the vehicle. And that's where, when OEMs like say BMW or Toyota or Honda are looking into hydrogen, this is where they're trying to drive down the costs so that these vehicles are more viable. So you can see for different classes of vehicles, since the drivers are different, the sort of business models that need to be adopted are also required to be different. Now, here's an example of how, for a large passenger vehicle, the costs can be dropped over time and make it on par with BEV. So right now, for a large passenger vehicle, this whole segment here constitutes around 47.2 USD cents per kilometer driven. And in comparison, the battery electric vehicle is nearly half that, 26.4. So to drive down the costs, the key requirements are first to scale up production. So you have economies of scale. That would be a key driver in reducing costs, almost 20%. The second sector is then scaling up even more to 700, so a combined 28%. The third is transitioning to higher refueling stations, larger hydrogen refueling stations. So HRS stands for that. And this in turn would mean that a particular asset in the form of a hydrogen refueling point would be used by multiple vehicles. So that spreads out the cost and therefore reduces the cost on this side. And finally, the last way to reduce is on how you're producing your hydrogen. This is on electrolysis, making improvements in technology, as well as scaling it up, producing through renewables. So that's where electrolysis of water to produce hydrogen would drive down the costs by 5% here, and therefore provide the total sort of reduction required for fuel cell vehicles on the passenger segment to compete with battery electric vehicles. Now, across different vehicle segments, you have different sort of total cost of ownership or price of hydrogen per kg. Now, what has been observed is when this cost of hydrogen being provided to a vehicle at the nozzle, so this is the pump at which the vehicle is being refueled, when that price of hydrogen is between 4 to 6 USD per kg, that's where nearly 50% of use cases of land-based transport can start adopting hydrogen. Right now, with systems like natural gas, Nikola has been able to push down costs to around 2 USD per kg. So that's where they have a huge advantage and are able to easily cater to this heavy duty and medium duty segment. So as seen in this chart, the key vehicles that will break through first are the heavy duty, medium duty, and long range vehicles. These are the ones which have where even a higher cost of hydrogen makes sense in moving people around. Smaller vehicles require around 3 USD or lower. So when Elon Musk says fuel cells are basically fuel cells, is mainly coming from the perspective of a small passenger vehicle. But when it comes to larger vehicles, it seems to make sense to switch to hydrogen when this sort of price point is reached. Now, when we look at the hydrogen technology for powering any vehicle, the core technology that is required is a fuel cell. And the value chain of that is important to understand when either any startup is looking to get into the space or an investor is looking to place some money. So the value chain consists of 5 segments. First is the fuel itself, mainly is the fuel type. Second is the fuel processor. This is basically your fuel cell. So one key difference that needs to be noted between a fuel cell and a battery is a battery stores as well as converts energy, meaning it stores energy in a chemical form and then converts it to electrical form when needed. A fuel cell is different. It doesn't store energy. It only converts whatever fuel is provided to electricity. So the fuel processor here refers to the fuel cell. The third is how you group these fuel cells together to build a stack. The fourth part is assembling a stack together for a particular application, and then finally deploying that application in the form of a vehicle. So I'll get into this one by one. So on the fuel side, we have broadly 5 different types of fuels: hydrogen itself, different types of alcohols. The most preferred is methanol, natural gas, ammonia, gasoline, and diesel. Each one of these would work differently with different types of different type of fuel cell. So it's important to choose the fuel cell based on the sort of fuel that is intended to be used. The fuel processor also comes in multiple types. I'll get into that in the next slide. Essentially, they are very similar to battery cells. They are either pouched or in between plates, and they are packed together in the form of stacks to build a module. So the stack itself consists of multiple parts: the anode, cathode, electrolyte, membrane, and interconnects. This is where each startup can provide different sort of services. Once the stack is built, balancing the stack through seals, manifolds, bus bars, and providing support structure would be the next value add in terms of any company that is looking to provide to enter the value chain. Under assembly, we are mainly looking at electronics and piping. So how do you condition the power, monitor temperature, fit in the pipes and valves, build in the cooling pumps, the enclosure to keep it safe, humidifier, and also how does it interface with the vehicle. So this entire sector comes more under system integration, and then translates to the vehicle itself, where it has to blend with the powertrain, motor, and other normal units that we see in an electric vehicle. So one key thing to note is that fuel cells are not high power devices, meaning they cannot provide energy in short bursts. They are more geared for marathon type of applications rather than for sprinter type of applications. So that's why almost every fuel cell would need a sort of high power energy storage device with it, which will be in the form of an ultra capacitor or a lithium ion battery, geared to provide that sort of high pulses that are required. So the diagram here provides an idea of how this all comes together. So you have the core of the system, which is the fuel cell stack. Around it is the fuel cell system box. Then you have the motors, drivetrains, PCU, and the ultra capacitor to provide the high power, as well as the tank. So as you can see, the fuel cell is separate from the tank, and that's the key difference between a battery and a fuel cell. So battery, both of these are actually combined. Now, in a passenger vehicle, I had mentioned that earlier that the key driver of a high cost of a hydrogen powered system is the fuel cell or the capex for the fuel cell. So this entire system would be of core focus for a passenger vehicle, while for a fleet, hydrogen fleet of trucks, heavy duty vehicles, it's not necessarily focused on this, but more in production and distribution of hydrogen. So now we look at the different types of fuel cells that are available. There are mainly six main types. You have the PEMFC, which is the polymer electrolyte membrane fuel cell, which is the most common. And then the alkaline fuel cell, phosphoric acid, molten carbonate, solid oxide, and direct methanol. So there are a number of applications for each one of these sort of fuel cells. Like different types of batteries can go into different types of applications. But primarily what is looked for in transport is mobility. So the PEMFC, the alkaline fuel cell, and the direct methanol fuel cell are considered the most portable and most suitable for fuel cell vehicle applications. When it comes to grid scale storage, the other three are more suitable. Now, these fuel cells need to be compared with the existing incumbents. What we have right now is lithium ion leading the pack. It went through the Gartner hype cycle, where in the 1970s, it was hyped up to be one of the most portable energy storage solutions, primarily made by Exxon. But only now are we seeing its full realization. So that's a good 40 years or so. Now, when it comes to fuel cells, they've started, they gained attention in around the 1980s, 90s in a big way. There was a hype then. But what we see now is a move towards a more mature solution, where standards are coming into place and these fuel cells are being more sought after. It's also being driven by the two of the factors mentioned in the start of this webinar, the lower carbon emissions, as well as the sort of energy requirements that are needed for these vehicles. So when compared to the other type of batteries available, so lithium sulfide, redox flow, sodium ion, magnesium ion, and sodium ion, right now fuel cells seem to be the best bet. In terms of lithium air, we are still in the process of plotting which exact fuel cell would be better than lithium air and which would be worse off than lithium air in the maturity scale. And we will keep our partners updated as we plot the different fuel cells on this stuff. But essentially, we see that the fuel cells have reached a point of maturity and are translating towards competing with lithium ion. These fuel cells are being sold in different markets, and all of them have certain sales. So what we have seen is the proton exchange membrane, PMFC or polymer exchange membrane, having the highest sales, followed closely by PFC and SOFC. While the largest adopters of fuel cells seem to be Asia and North America. Asia driven primarily by China and Japan. There are a number of companies which are producing these. In Singapore itself, we have Horizon and Horizon Systems. Right opposite EcoLabs Centre in the Clean Tech Park. But there are a few other companies as well. Spectronic is another company which is doing a bit of integration in Singapore. And we are working with some of these companies to help them take their products to market. Now, there are a number of startups dealing with a number of these different challenges that we have seen so far, primarily on the fuel cell side and materials for fuel cells. We have basically are working towards classifying them on a scale of technology versus market. This chart is still in progress, but what we have seen is a lot of the companies fall into the emerging market, emerging technology, where it is at a TRL 4 to 6, meaning a concept has been demonstrated, and the companies are in the process of building a prototype. And these are also for emerging markets. The markets are not yet ready. So essentially, these companies would love to move into the mature stage of high TRL as well as a mature market, or high TRL as well as an emerging market. And that's where EcoLabs comes in to provide infrastructure and financial support, so the companies can make this sort of translation. And we work with investor partners as well to make this happen. With that, I can probably take a short break and ask for questions. And then we can dive into one of the case studies that I have prepared with respect to electric buses.
Hi, thank you, Aravind, for the sharing. I think we have quite a few questions. Maybe let me start with the first one before we go into the audience questions. Yeah. You mentioned that the key driver for fuel cell innovation are very much concentrated in Japan, China, and Korea. And you also mentioned that most of the current deployment happen in Asia and North America. Yeah. So what do you think would be the key driver to accelerate its commercialization for hydrogen fuel cell sector? And maybe just an additional follow-up questions. Do you think that hydrogen will be the mainstream energy storage solution, and at which time point do you think it will happen?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So there are two parts to it. The first part is, do you think hydrogen, could you repeat that? Do you think hydrogen would be
the mainstream energy storage?
Okay. Yeah, so for hydrogen, the key thing is the application. It becomes mainstream specific to an application. I don't think, from what I've seen so far, hydrogen can replace batteries. They work in tandem. Like as I showed you, there are different costs involved, where hydrogen breaks even with batteries. In some cases, it does not at all. So it will become mainstream in the sense that for certain applications where downtime is a big issue, that's why you're looking at heavy duty vehicles, forklifts, mining systems, buses. There, it's a big problem to spend time on charging, and fuel cells would go mainstream there. For passenger vehicles and other segments, it seems more likely that electric vehicles would be the norm for them.
All right, thank you so much. We actually have a few questions from the audience. Victor, would you like to voice your questions live by giving you? Yeah, you can actually unmute yourself and ask the question.
Right. Hi, good morning. Hey, thank you for the very good explanation so far. I think my question is basically, because many countries right now already have an ongoing roadmap for deployment of electric vehicles.
Sorry, Victor, sorry, I'm not able to hear you clearly. Could you speak a bit louder?
Sure, is this better?
Yeah, this is better.
Okay, great. So once again, thank you for your presentation so far. My question relates to the ongoing roadmaps by the different countries, because currently they have roadmaps to roll out electric vehicles already. And so now with putting into the mix the potential for hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, how does that gel with the existing roadmaps for the deployment of electric vehicles?
Okay, so I don't think so I've gone through a few of these roadmaps, particularly China's, because they're the ones who drove the battery revolution, and it's highly likely that they're going to drive the hydrogen revolution as well. So from what I've seen, they have not tried to gel it with what happens on the electric side. These are two separate segments. They treat it that way in the roadmap. But outside of the roadmap, the incentives that they offer to companies, like the current battery vehicle companies in China, for example, the incentives are geared towards higher and higher energy densities, or certain values which push the manufacturer or OEM to move towards hydrogen. So that's how they reorient the industry, but not in the roadmap itself. They don't try to gel both together. Does it answer your question, Victor? So,
Yes, thank you so much.
okay.
All right, thank you so much. We have a question from Joshua. Joshua, would you like to unmute yourself? I'm allowing you to speak.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Dr. Ravin, for the presentation. I think I learned a lot today, being a fuel cell noob. My question is, can you share more about how current fuel cells are handling contaminants like carbon monoxide, which can lead to efficiency loss, or how current technology is handling this?
Okay, that's a good question. So I'm not fully, immersed in fuel cell technology, so I won't probably be able to produce the best answer for you, but I can give you some suggestions of how they handle it. So the core issue with these sort of contaminants is they can react with the catalyst and make them inactive, and therefore waste the catalyst, which are quite expensive. So a way to handle this would be to use sacrificial catalysts, cheaper catalysts to react with the contaminants and probably go out as waste. But this is a suggestion. So I'm not fully sure about how the contaminants are handled.
Okay, got it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.
All right, thank you. We have a question from Lika. Lika, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Hello, Lika. Sorry, I can't hear you again. Sorry. Hello.
Lika, I can't hear you as well. So maybe there's some technical issue. Maybe I will voice out Lika's question.
Okay.
Can hydrogen be used as an energy source in other sectors other than transport, such as manufacturing or buildings?
Yes, predominantly hydrogen has three use cases. One is in industry, the second is in building systems, and the third is transport. The reason we are focusing on transport here is, as I showed in one of the earlier roadmap slides, most of the countries would like to develop hydrogen economy for transport first, before adapting it to different other use cases. So this means that that's where the technology is needed first, and that's why I've dwelt on that. But at a later date, maybe we can address the buildings as well as industry side.
All right, we have a hand raised. Naku, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Your voice is low as well.
Yeah. Can you speak a bit louder?
How about this?
Louder, louder.
Okay. Can you guys? Can anyone hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you, but your voice is low. But please go ahead. No problem.
Okay. I'll just power through. I'm curious about the maritime sector, and you'd shown a graph. If you could just go back to the graph, please, it'll just be more useful as I frame my question. Yeah, up ahead. Yes. Okay. In this one,
yeah.
So you can see that the fuel cell powertrain capex is only 1%, and the hydrogen fuel ranges between 12 to 30%, and the other cost of ownerships is mostly for other equipment, auxiliary equipment, and the other running of the ship. So what are the assumptions in this graph, and why is there such a steep curve heading downwards to 2030s in both cases?
Okay, so one of the key factors driving the steepness is, from my understanding, the IMO regulations, which kick in over time to reduce emissions. So that's why if you look at the diesel line, it goes up. So this is mainly regulation imposed. Now, when you look at this, if your question is on this drop itself, that is fairly normal. So I probably don't have a slide on this here, but the technology development slope for fuel cells follows something very similar to batteries. And so there is an initial fast drop in costs, and then it levels out after some time. Sorry, what was the other question? Assumptions made?
Yes, yes. What are the assumptions made?
Okay, so the assumptions here are primarily that, okay, I can tell in terms of the costs that are mentioned here, the 1%, 57%, 12%, 30%. So the ferries here have been based off deployments in Europe, and those have served as the numbers for this particular estimate. The capex requirements are based on the shipbuilding costs. So one of the most expensive parts of the ship is its hull and other aspects of it. So that's why they've taken a baseline of how much is required to build these ships, and that constitutes the high capex. In terms of OPEX, the assumptions have been mainly through the deployments that have been done so far in Europe.
Okay, thank you. I just have another question as well.
Yeah.
So you see, so we know that the storage and production of hydrogen is crucial to bringing down the, increasing the viability in all sectors, land, air, and water. Which are the most viable solutions in, let's say, now and in the next 5 to 10 years in storage and production?
So so my focus so far has been only on end use. Going forward, I would be looking at production and distribution as well. So right now, I unfortunately don't have an answer for that. The focus, as I said, is mainly on end use cases.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Quite a detailed presentation so far. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Right, thank you so much. Arvin, I believe we have a few more questions, but may I suggest that you run through the case study first before then we jump back to the question.
Okay, sure. I can run through that first and get back to this. So, these are a final set of slides on the case study itself, and just to refresh your memory on one of the slides where I had portrayed the different vehicles in terms of maturity, in terms of carbon emissions versus total versus conventional fuels. We noticed that the buses were on the top right part of the quadrant, and the reason they were there was what I'm going to delve into right now. So for buses, mainly hydrogen-powered buses fall under the electric bus category, but there are multiple ways of powering an electric bus. So that's what the first plot here shows. You have lithium-ion, fuel cell, lead acid, nickel metal hydride, and other forms. As you can see, right now, 2018, 2019, the core focus has been on lithium-ion, and they take up more than 75% of the market share. So in terms of fuel cell, it's still not yet deployed in a big way. However, when you look at the fuel cell vehicles itself, so in terms of fuel cell vehicles, fuel cells can be used to power buses, cars, commercial or industrial vehicles, low-speed vehicles, scooters, a number of these types. So under that category, we can see that there has been a steady growth of fuel cell-powered vehicles here, mainly going from 4 billion worth of USD worth of market to almost doubling in 2024. So that's the expectation we have. And the predominant sector under this is buses, which have the same sort of profile as lithium has for the entire vehicle segment. So what you see is buses have more than 80% of the entire market in terms of fuel cells. And that's where they seem to start making sense. And that's where the case study here is focused on. Now, the fuel cell bus market alone is growing at 11.2% compounded annually. And it's, as I said, expected to hit around $7 billion in USD by 2024. So now in the buses segment, there are three main types. You have the urban short distance. So this is basically what we see in Singapore. If you're in the NTU area, 199, 179, those kind of buses. Then you have the long distance buses, which are basically probably shuttling from, say, Bedok to Jurong West. And then the third type is the long haul coach, which is basically Singapore to Malaysia or Singapore to Kuala Lumpur. So each of these buses have a different curve and a different set of requirements. And that's what makes it fascinating in terms of how we can see which particular class of vehicles will adopt hydrogen first. So the most viable seems to be the long haul coach, mainly because of the range involved and lesser downtime. So as you can see here, we have three curves as we saw for the boats. One is for fuel cells. Then you have battery vehicles on the light blue and the diesel or IC engine. So as you can see, by 2025, the fuel cells would have, on a total cost of ownership, be much cheaper than battery electric, and also even compete with the diesel vehicle. So that's a huge disruption that is waiting to happen, because it's not just battery vehicles that we're looking at, but the conventional buses itself. For long distance urban transportation, as I said, it's from like Bedok to Jurong West. It takes a bit more time, where battery vehicles will first breach the barrier with respect to existing conventional diesel vehicles, and only then would the fuel cells take over, probably in the later half of this decade, 2025 to 2030. And finally, for short distance transportation, which is the highest form of bus transport we see in Singapore, the chances of fuel cell overtaking battery electric vehicles seems to be rather low. As you can see, even after 2050, they seem to be rather neck and neck. And that's where it makes sense. If you look at the Land Transport Authority's sort of tenders for local buses, it has predominantly been focused on electric. They have tried out three types of vendors, but they haven't gone for a fuel cell bus. And this is primarily, as you can see with this chart, for Singapore, it doesn't make sense to have hydrogen within the country, at least for urban short distance buses. Now, when we look at the total cost of ownership, similar to the boats, it has been split into multiple sectors here. And the urban bus has a similar, for short distance or long distance, has a similar sort of constituent. So that's why it's one plot here, while the coach, a long distance bus, is plotted differently. So the key thing to note here is the powertrain, which consists of the fuel cell, the supercapacitor, and a few other systems, constitutes only 10% or 12% of the entire cost of the bus. So any innovations there are just going to cause a small dent in the total cost of ownership. It's not going to drive down your cost a lot. However, one of the key requirements for the long distance bus is the 40% from the hydrogen fuel. So if you're able to drive down hydrogen fuel costs in a big way, that's where there's a lot of impact in making that sort of a vehicle viable for hydrogen deployment. The other area to focus on for urban buses is other capex. So this is mainly the bus body, the chassis, the air conditioning systems, and all of that. So as you can see, big changes in, even if there are huge leaps in the powertrain or the fuel cell, the key impact comes only from the rest of the sectors, which is the actual body of the bus, the fuel, as well as other operational costs. So the key, three key takeaways here are, first, the full battery buses would be outcompeted by fuel cell buses, and that would happen for the urban, for the long haul by 2025, and for the long distance urban by probably 2030. For short range, it does not seem to outcompete, and electric seems to be the preferred form of transport till 2050. Now, this is one of the biggest takeaways from this particular talk that we have, and that is on refueling versus recharging. So a lot of the economics makes sense to adopt battery electric vehicles first, mainly because the understanding is that, oh, we have another 5 to 10 years before hydrogen kicks in. But what you see here would probably make you rethink that sort of strategy. So for battery electric vehicles, the initial cost per vehicle is in thousands of dollars, USD per vehicle in thousands, is around 4.7 when you start off with a battery electric vehicle compared to a fuel cell, which is 16. So that's around 4 times higher. But as you keep scaling up and deploying in the form of a fleet, you have superchargers which are which double the costs per charger. Then you have you increase utilization of existing chargers, which would decrease the cost. But then this is where the kicker is. You have a 7x increase in the modification of the electricity grid to meet demand. Now, what do I mean by modification of the electricity grid? This is something we faced in Singapore, and we are going to face in Singapore in the near future. As you have, so in Singapore, each bus depot has around 300 to 500 buses. So as each of these buses charges, they are going to draw power at the same time. So the model that most of the Chinese fleets of buses work on is they run during the day and charge during night, or run during the morning, charge at afternoon, run during the evening, and charge again at night. So this kind of scheduled charging means that a number of buses charge at the same time, and that places a sudden huge peak demand on your grid. This is where your grid needs to be modified to meet that sort of a demand. Now, this form of charging is called overnight charging. Now, there's another form called opportunity charging, where the bus probably charges after every round trip. So this would be at the bus interchange in the malls. There would be a short 5 to 10 minute charge. It boosts up and then goes out for a route again, around again. But again, for this sort of short charging, you need a sudden high power requirement, which none of these bus depots or malls are built for. And that's where there needs to be a huge investment in meeting that demand. And that's where fuel cell vehicles start becoming far more worthwhile. So when we start with the $16,000 per vehicle cost, we go down, we have a 60% drop when you start investing in hydrogen refueling stations, because of larger stations, this will be used by multiple vehicles. That further goes down to 4x. And then finally, this is the part where there's a huge delta between refueling and recharging, where the scale up of these compression centers, so you need to compress hydrogen. Let's say you're going for liquefied hydrogen or high pressure systems. It's far easier to scale up at a particular, like a gasoline station converted to a hydrogen station, rather than setting up a electricity grid, because the investment does not scale with the storage. But in the case of battery, the investment scales linearly with the storage. So that's where the biggest impediment comes. And even though we might be adopting battery electric vehicles now, battery electric buses now, in the next few years, when we start scaling up, we will see the impacts of a higher cost to operate these vehicles. And that's where the hydrogen starts making more sense. But again, both of them have pros and cons. Battery electric vehicles, the pro is that it's a lower upfront cost. and higher cost for infrastructure later. For battery electric vehicles, it's both high upfront for the vehicle as well as infrastructure, but then it goes cheaper as you scale your fleet. So the lowest cost application is sensitive to a number of other local conditions. So what is the local cost of electricity, or what type of fuel is being used? So in Singapore, if natural gas is being used, it might make sense to adopt that instead of electricity powered buses. We have the second factor is the available infrastructure. It's far easier to retrofit a current gasoline station with hydrogen equipment rather than charging station. The third is what sort of range is required for that particular locality for the vehicles. And finally, what mileage is expected of the vehicle. So just to sum up, the key takeaways from this talk are threefold. Expect to see hydrogen-based buses and heavy-duty vehicles, mainly forklifts and trucks, within the next 5 years. This is not too far out. And this will most definitely outcompete battery-powered vehicles. The second is the charging infrastructure of battery-powered vehicles is the greatest impediment. As I showed earlier, it's a 7x increase that comes in later down the line and can disrupt a lot of economics. And the third key takeaway is on the maritime sector. Expect to see 2025 to 2030 being the point when smaller ships are deployed, primarily ferries, and then there would be a scale up for bigger ships. Okay, thank you so much. I'm open to questions, and yeah, please feel free to ask any doubts that you may have.
Thank you, Arapin. Because we are a bit overrun by the timing, so maybe let me make some announcement before we jump back to the Q&A. So thank you so much for the insightful sharing on the hydrogen potential and opportunity ahead. At the end of this webinar, there will be a survey for the audience to give feedback to enhance our future webinar. So I encourage you all to give your inputs on the survey and help us continue to present excellent webinar for the audience. So do follow us on the EcoLabs linking page and join us live next Monday on the 15th of June at 3:30 p.m. for the next EcoLab webinar series, the EcoLabs SDGX webinar series part 2 on startup ecosystem. So now coming back to the Q&A, Joshua have another question. So Joshua, would you like to voice your questions? Okay, so maybe I'll ask the question for Joshua on behalf. Do you foresee gas station of the future having both battery charging for passenger battery EV and hydrogen top-up infrastructure for big trucks in the future?
It's a good question. There are a lot of safety issues when you have charging and hydrogen side by side. So I think it's highly likely that EV charging infrastructure would be relegated to car parks and home environments, while hydrogen would be in a dedicated gas station. I don't think they would mix together.
Okay.
I'll probably, yeah.
Right. We have some questions from Parikesh. Parikesh, would you like to unmute yourself and voice your question?
Hi, Dr. Arvind. Thanks for the sharing.
Yeah.
Actually, I have two questions. One was that what would be the $ per kg mark where the balance will tip towards the fuel cells compared to the EVs in Singapore? Of course, like you mentioned rightly, there's a cost of infrastructure to be built up when it comes to the power charging stations as well as the peak demand as well.
Yeah.
Compared to a hydrogen ecosystem wherein you have charging stations and the charging happens in like a normal fuel station kind of a stuff. So it hardly takes like a minute to fill up and then you just move on. So that was the first question in terms of the $ per kg cost in Singapore. And the second question I had was in terms of the disposal of the batteries. So although there could be a wave of changeover from the conventional diesel to a battery now, but another 10 years down the line, when it comes to the disposal of all these batteries, there would be a cost of disposal due to environmental concerns. And was that factored into the kind of the viability we are talking about, or given an option, wherein obviously, like you mentioned, there's a high capex for a fuel cell infrastructure as well as the vehicle now. You invest in that, but you don't have this, kind of issue later on after 10 years of, and then of course there's the second context to it, which is a double investment, wherein you already kind of invest in the electrical, the battery infrastructure as well as the vehicle, and then later on you're going to switch over to fuel cells. So and putting all these in the context of a country's fuel policies, so be it hydrogen being available for even power production, power generation, a switch from natural gas to hydrogen going on from 2030 onwards, that would also significantly drop the cost of hydrogen per kg. So in a long term, for organizations to make that move, whether should they be skipping over, the electrical portion and the batteries and just move on to FCs, although there could be, high capex investments upfront.
Yeah, I think that's good. So 3 questions, probably just start with the first one. The cost of hydrogen in Singapore. So we are in the process of developing the estimates for that. What we have right now is just from our understanding on the US side. So what we see is people are able to drive it down to $2 per kg for natural gas based hydrogen, and that is that makes it quite viable in terms of competing with electric vehicles. So in terms of Singapore's number, we'll have to get back to you. I think once we are done with our report, we will be sharing a lot of this information, and you can get it from that. The second question on batteries, yes, it is a big problem. The recycling has not been considered in this cost. And for this, it's also not been considered for the fuel cell on both sides. We mainly looked at well to wheel, not from wheel to whatever, end of life. We have not looked into it. So there is a huge difficulty in battery recycling. We see a lot of opportunity for startups to pursue this. At EcoLabs itself, we are supporting one particular startup which is looking to scale up its technology to treat this battery waste. But one of the key challenges with battery waste is not so much the quantity, but the fact that there are different types of chemistries. If we are able to standardize to either 2 or 3 chemistries, one for high energy, one for high power, and one for hybrid, that would drive down recycling and make it more viable a lot more. There are technologies to do that, but it's this sort of mixed feedstock in the form of batteries that comes in that causes a lot of problems. So to go back to your question, it's not been included in this cost. And your final question on hydrogen, whether the government should probably look, or the industry should look at switching to it, even though it's high capex. I would say, at least from the sort of roadmaps that we have provided timeline, if you're probably not in the bus or public transport industry, it's not a real urgent need to switch right now. You still have a decade to go before the viability start kicking in. So it might be a case of switching too early. So probably not the best idea to switch off. Switch to hydrogen immediately.
Yeah. So actually, what I meant was because from 2025 onwards, as we see hydrogen being kind of introduced into the Singapore market for non-production and manufacturing purposes, and then from there on, organizations with big fleet, they can consider the transition, and that transition can happen over the next 5 to 8 years, because depending on the current fleet, there'll be an age to it, and once it's fully depreciated, and then they'll make that change. So the slow injection of the fuel cell vehicles after 2025, coming towards 2030, that was the context I was kind of referring to, because obviously, because if you want to make the change to the electrical, once we invest 2025 onwards, that will kind of again last for another 10 to 15 years, and then you would have missed the cycle for fuel cells.
Yes, I agree with that. I think beyond 2025, definitely, I think it needs to have a relook and consider. But at least next 5 years, I don't see a need to switch. Yeah.
Yep. Correct. I think next 5 years we may not have enough hydrogen as well to change to
Not enough supply. Yeah, true.
Okay, we have
Thank you.
one last question. Thank you so much. Sorry. We have one last question from Hans. Why do you expect the total cost of ownership for internal combustion engine buses to come down in the next 10 years?
Oh, okay. That's a good question. So, I need to have a look at the assumptions in this particular study. Our core focus was not so much on ICE, but on the hydrogen and battery electric vehicles. But I can have a look at this and get back to you. From my understanding, the cost is with the normal reduction in costs over time with adoption of a technology. But it's something I can get back to you on.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you so much, Arvind, for the sharing. I think it's very insightful and very interactive session that we have today. And thank you all the audience to join us in this session and the interaction. Just a gentle reminder, at the end of this session, there will be a survey for you to give feedback to enhance our future webinars, and to join us live next Monday, 15 June at 3:30 for the EcoLabs SDGX webinar series on startup ecosystem. Thank you so much and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.